Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we tend to, in retrospect, assume that Islamic scholarship has always been very firmly the preserve of men. But right at the beginning of Islam, it wasn't really like that, was it?
Yeah.
And even if you read some of the tabaqat works, these vast biographical dictionaries of medieval scholars, particularly if you look at the scholars of hadith, you'll find that quite a few of the respected hadith scholars of the Muslim Middle Ages, if we can use that term, were actually women. And they were teaching publicly. You think of Karima al-Marwaziyah, for instance, the great Rawiya of the Sahih al-Bukhari. All of the great chains of transmission for Sahih al-Bukhari tend to go through there. You think of people like Sitt al-Wuzara in 8th century Cairo, who was one of the truly great fuqaha, and who was consulted by the ulama at the time, who would travel to sit at her feet to ask for fatwas. But more recently that seems to have died away. So do you think that this obligation to study the ulama of Islam, which is so urgent for our young people today, actually applies to our young women as well?
The hadith that's related, Ibn Majah relates it, Bayhaqi I believe relates it, that seeking knowledge, and there it's Talab al-ilm, it has the instrument of definition, definitive article. There means sacred knowledge, which would include kifayat, the collective duties as well. But the primary, the ayn, is what really is being said. There is the ayn knowledges, which are sacred knowledges, not the worldly knowledges, which are kifayat. The hadith says every man and Muslim wa Muslima. And the Prophet ﷺ rarely uses the male and the female together unless it's an emphasis in order that it's not misunderstood. And that's one of the times when he did stress the female component, because one, it was very alien to their culture for women to be educated. Umar radiallahu anhu is recorded as saying, that we considered women similar to animals prior to Islam. This was the Arab perspective, and there was just radical transformation. And I think it's really fascinating. One of the Western criticisms of Islam is the idea of two witnesses, two females to one male. And what I find really fascinating about that is that in hadith, if the woman fulfills the 5 qualifications of a sahih hadith, if she is a babita, meticulous in her narration, adila, if she's just in her actions, that there's no shudud, there's no illa, weaknesses in her transmission, then the isnad goes all the way back to the Prophet, that one muhadditha is accepted completely. And certainly witnessing about a hadith is the highest of all in Islam. And so I think that's a very clear indication that the 2 to 1 has nothing to do with a woman's capacity. It's more really just a social allowing for an excuse for women not to have to get involved in affairs that would preoccupy them for more important affairs. And I don't really know anybody that wants to bear witness against people. I certainly don't. I mean, it's not, I've always find that odd. It's kind of, people say, you don't see people lining up to be on jury duty or So yeah, absolutely. Women, I think probably one of the greatest causes for the state of our ummah now is the fact that our women are deplorably uneducated, and they raise the children. In Mauritania, which, although it's certainly not an example for economic flourishment, it's still a place where Islam is practiced on a large scale. One of the things that I noticed in the children, and they've been the healthiest children I've seen in the Muslim world, is that the many of the women are scholars. One of the things that fascinated me was that the women particularly emphasize seerah. They learn seerah, and what they do is transmit these stories instead of like reading ridiculous bedtime stories to children. They tell the stories of the Sahaba, of the awliya, of the great scholars, and they inculcate this in their children. And they're also oftentimes scholars of the the Quraysh, they know like the Meccan, all the lineages and the names of the Sahaba and who they were related to is fascinating. So we absolutely need female scholars. Amina Muhsin Wadud, who's a scholar in African American scholar in America, she she talks about the need for the feminine perspective being presented, and I think there is a validity to that critique. Although I don't agree with like Fatima Mernisি's whole idea.
Well, this is the problem, isn't it? Everybody assumes, they're jumping on the feminist bandwagon. This is a Trojan horse for westernization and destruction of the Muslim family, etc., etc. But clearly on the basis of the Quran and the Sunnah and the practice of the early Muslims, which is supposed to be our model. There's so many examples of Muslim women who didn't just stay at home and spin, but they were
out there fighting with the men and doing all these things. Yes.
And I should think, 15% of the great hadiths of Islam have women as key figures in the isnads.
Right. Aisha's one of the 7 of the Sahaba that relate over 2,000 hadiths in the
and Salama as well.
Salama is another great muhadditha. So absolutely, it's imperative. If we're going to reinvigorate this ummah with any with anything, we have to have women that are going to, when Fatima Mernisি's argument, is that where are the women in Islam? To me, I think that Malik is not possible without the mother of Malik. The Ummahat al-Rijal, the mothers of men, these were great women.
Absolutely.
And they produced these men. Because we know the importance of the first 7 years, which is almost solely the mother's domain in all cultures.
But it wasn't just that, was it? They were also out teaching in the madrasas.
They were in the madrasas, absolutely.
If you look at Ibn Asakir's History of Damascus, he names about 1,000 of his teachers, and 80 of them were women. And that's already, the 6th century?
Where is that is there any equivalent of that in European?
In Christianity, absolutely not.
Julian of Norwich or something?
They were so excluded from life.
Well, I think they didn't think that they actually had intellects for a while.
Yes, I think it was the 7th century they had the council at Poitiers, and they decided that women didn't actually have souls.
Right.
And hence they were sort of like household goods. Nowadays you get a washing machine, but in those days you'd require.
You had to wash a woman.
Yes. But they had no more souls than did a washing machine or a toaster.
It is. I think China is probably the only other place where they did have female scholastics. I don't know about India, if in the pre-Islamic Indian culture, but I know China did have some female scholars. But certainly, I know Ibn Hajar, when he went to Damascus to study hadith, he had 4 teachers and 3 were women. And in the Tadhkarat al-Huffaz, I think there's about 500 women mentioned from the. There seems to be a particular affinity to hadith literature.
It's interesting, that, isn't it?
Yeah. One of the things interesting to me is that there's not a lot of literature, books written by women, which I think is interesting, and I think one of the reasons for that, in Mauritania, for instance, there are many women that are actually scholars that do not write. They actually literally do not write. Their husbands would write the things that they memorized on the lawh and things like that. Like the wife of my teacher, who, mashallah, she's a faqiha in the Maliki fiqh, and she's knew grammar very well and had memorized 2/3 of the Quran, and was still studying at about the age of 65, still memorizing things. But she did not write. She literally never learned how to write, but read.
In a sense, that's the sunnah as well, isn't it? And
right, at Ummiyun. So what would we say to this 18-year-old? We didn't really deal with that.
Well, you've gone a bit into this extraordinary feat of memorization that seems to be a sine qua non of the traditional scholar. Now, a lot of young people say nowadays, well, I haven't memorized Quran, I haven't been brought up with that faculty activated in my brain. Can I really study Islam seriously if I simply don't have the ability to memorize hundreds of pages of texts?
I think this is a really interesting point that's fascinated me, and I've done a lot of reading about Western research into memories, and I've even read like Cicero's, De Memoriam, and some of the Greek, like Aristotle has a short treatise on memory, and the idea of the loci and the memory techniques that were used, mnemonics and acronyms and these things. Certainly the Renaissance produced some extraordinary, phenomenal examples of the human capacity to memorize. One of the things that we are not taught in the West is techniques of memorization, and this was something that I learned from the Mauritanians. Mnemonics is used very often in Mauritania. Just to give two very quick examples, it's certainly used in Tajweed. Huruf al-Qalqala is Qutub Jed, that's, everybody learns that. But for instance, in memorization of Quran, there's a lot of mutashabihat ayat, and there's mnemonic devices used for that. In, for instance, the وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. What I learned was kalafa is the way it goes, kafirun, zalimun, fasiqun. So you learn a mnemonic to recognize, the sequential. And another one in Surah Al-Saf would be fadkam, which would be fasiqun, zalimun, kafirun, mushrikun. And these are ways of learning how to memorize that we're not taught in Western, unfortunately. And a lot of it, there's not a whole lot of emphasis put on memory. Memories, feats of memory are really quaint, and oftentimes they're carnival acts, or they're, on television.
Yes.
We have this guy, David Letterman, in America. It'd be kind of like something he'd have on. His television program is this kind of thing that people are going to, laugh at or marvel at or something, but there's not this idea of learning the knowledge of the past that it needs. في صدور الذين أوتوا العلم. I mean, the Quran says it's in the breasts of those who have been given knowledge, and part of that is literally memorizing. And one of the things I think we have to do, and we're both fathers, so I think it's something that you've obviously thought about, is what's literally taking place in the brain within the first 11 years. Actually, it's now in neurology they've found that 11 years is when all of the myelination is taking place, and at the age of 11 it literally stops. So and memory is one of the most potent ways of developing fields within the brain itself. And basically at 11 we have what we're going to use for the rest of our life. That's what's been developed. And I think memory prior to 11 is absolutely essential. The main emphasis, I'm going to talk about this later on today, I have a talk about this, but the main emphasis for children should be memorization. There should be very little emphasis on actual ratiocination and spatial reasonings and things like this. I mean, even Piaget and their own Western educational theorists have really proven a lot of this stuff. And this was the traditional approach, that you memorize when you're young, and then you learn the what they call the aqliyat, the intellectual sciences of dialectics, of jadal and mantiq, logic, and these type things, learning how to think, and then you begin the process of, after about 15 or 16, is to learn the tools whereby you can actually begin to reflect and think deeply on much of what you've memorized. In terms of an 18-year-old who's coming in who has not memorized sometimes almost nothing, both in English and in other languages, I think that we need to literally learn the techniques for increasing our memory. I mean, I believe, and even though that there's kind of, it's a moot point amongst Western theorists whether or not memory can be developed. and also why some people have brilliant memories and other people don't. Certainly in Mauritania there are families that are known to have very powerful memories, and they actually believe that there is an inherited aspect to memory, and I think that's true. But there's also another aspect which I've always kind of maintained my hope, is what the Muslims have traditionally called al-fath, which is an opening. And we know now, I think in a lot of the brain research, is that that we do actually memorize everything we see and hear, but it's locked away in the subconscious, and we really don't have a direct access to it. It's what they call in Arabic istihdar, the ability to
retrieve the data.
To bring present what is known. And Ibn Taymiyyah was notorious for this ability. He had this phenomenal ability to use the Quran as a hujjah and a proof. And I've seen this, whereas some scholars have their capacity to do that is not as great. They kind of go through this scanning, where you ask them an ayah and they'll kind of go.
The hard disk has to turn a few
exactly.
times.
It has to. It's like a CD-ROM. There, it's not as fast as others. So you've got 286 memories, 386 and 486, and so I think that's one aspect. But I don't think we should despair of it. I found personally, although I really don't consider my memory to be that great, but I found personally that there is a facilitation that Allah gives to His deen. I have found memorizing, for instance, du'as of the Prophet, hadiths, verses of the Quran, that trying to memorize comparable treaties or amounts of words in my own language is extremely difficult. And I don't know if it has to do with the cadences of the Arabic, but I personally really do believe that there is a divine facilitation. And certainly the most important element there is intention, is pure intention. So I think that people can still do that even at the age of 18, 19, 20. I personally have known people that have memorized the entire Quran as adults, and very worthy and honorable task to set out and to accomplish.
Niyyah is the key thing, isn't it? If you have the right niyyah, the doors somehow swing open in front of you. And if you don't, but you have the best academic institutions behind you, you simply don't make any progress.
The Riyadh al-Salihin begins the book with Kitab al-Niyyah, the book of intention. The Arba'in of Imam al-Nawawi begins with the hadith of intention. Sahih Muslim begins his opus with, niyyah that's ultimately what it is. I think one of the beautiful hadiths is whoever learns knowledge to impress the scholars or to amaze the ignorant people, that there's no he could just take his seat in the hellfire. There's no, that's not why we should be seeking this knowledge. It should be, part of it is really to make the intention to preserve, to become a preserver of the deen of Allah, because the deen of Allah is not preserved in books, and it never has been. It's preserved by human beings that are willing to really struggle and struggle against their own selves. I mean, it's easy to come home and turn on the TV and sit back and watch, and I think it's worse here because BBC programming is more sophisticated and more interesting, so you can convince yourself you're kind of learning something. But it's very easy just to sit back and be entertained by the age. But it's like Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. That's ultimately what this culture does. It just amuses its populace to death. And we're told in the Quran that life wasn't created for an amusement or a pastime. And ultimately we should be people of, I say the Muslim should be a mujahid mujtahid. Somebody who's a man of and a woman of jihad and ijtihad. And jihad is both struggling against the self, but also against social injustices outside of us. And then being a mujtahid, of somebody that has internalized the struggle. I mean, the 8th form in Arabic is a reflexive. It's to internalize the first form. So ijtihad is literally internalizing the struggle. And that's what our youth needs to do. And also, I think which absolutely essential for the youth to be aware of, is that youth, and it's something we cannot appreciate at 20, but we can appreciate, say, at 35, and I think hopefully at 50 it'll be even more clear. But one of the things at 20 that's very difficult to appreciate is that people that are older than us have been through certain stages, and we have to understand the contextual nature of life itself, that a lot of our feelings at the age of 20 have to do with the age that we're in. And to be a man or woman of depth and substance, we have to have the continuum constantly in perspective. The Muslim is somebody that recognizes that this is a journey from the cradle to the grave, and we will go through stages, but ultimately the goal should always be present, and therefore to get caught up in fleeting matters of youth is very dangerous without the guidance and wisdom of age. Right. I mean, the shuyukh were not called shuyukh for nothing. Shaykh means old man, and shaykha means old woman. And people can be shaykh before their time, but it means they have the wisdom of old age. And it might happen at the age of 25, or in Malik's case at the age of 17, when he was giving fatwa and teaching in Medina. Yes. So the idea of having the depth of old age and recognizing, and the Prophet ﷺ articulated it beautifully in the hadith, لَيْسَ مِنَّا مَنْ لَمْ يُوَقِّرْ كَبِيرَنَا وَلَا يَرْحَمْ صَغِيرَنَا. He's not from us who doesn't respect the age and the wisdom that comes with age, and also who does not have compassion and mercy on the youth, and recognize that a lot of the energy that the youth have, a lot of what they want to do. I mean, I think, for instance, in England I've come across, there's some politicized groups of youth that are getting very politically active, and I think there's a lot of sincere energy there, that these people are struggling with injustices, with disenfranchisement, with the conditions of the ummah, but how we need guidance. It can't simply be that our young people become really anarchist in a sense of just going out and tearing down as opposed to building, because like Sultan Abdul Hamid said, I've never seen a revolutionary build what he could destroy. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that.
Yes, it's interesting that so many of these groups which claim to adhere to the way of the Salaf actually seem completely oblivious to the fact that the one thing the Salaf didn't do was to go out into public places and jump up and down and wave flags and shout Allahu Akbar, Jihad, Jihad. They actually looked at the situation and figured out what was the most effective way to deal with it. And if it meant they became scholars and they spent 20 years doing that, then that's what they did. Rolled up their sleeves and they did it. If they thought, well, it means rather than jumping around in Trafalgar Square and shouting about the Western conspiracy in Bosnia, we actually go to Bosnia and study
and do something.
Study how to fight a war, or even dig holes for the Mujahideen,
or nurse, or heal the sick. Absolutely.
But I'm sure
that's an excellent point.
But just to jump up and down and to shout one's frustration doesn't dissipate the frustration at all. You might do momentarily, but you go back home and you're in the same problem.
You might have seen the hadith that's related by Tabarani, that Al-Khimari, the muhaddith from Morocco, mentions in one of his books, that one of the signs of the end of time is that the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, وَيَكُونَ الْغَزُو صِيَاحًا, that the ghazwa would just end up being shouting, and really it's a pathetic statement about our condition, because ultimately I think over 30 years or even longer of Western demonstration, because it's a Western methodology, like you said, it's not from our minhaj. The Prophet, in fact, he did not allow his companions to go to the Kaaba and shout. He told them not to do it. We have that recorded, that some of the Sahaba wanted to go to the Kaaba and declare their Islam amidst the mushrikeen, and the Prophet ﷺ did not allow that. And we also know one of the things in his descriptions that Qadi Iyad mentions, is mentioned in the hadith, لَمْ يَكُنْ صَخَابًا, he never shouted. And also on the jihads, he used to tell them to lower their voices doing dhikr. on the jihad, saying La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, and he used to say, Antum la tad'una asam, you're not calling a deaf Lord. You don't need to raise your voices. So who are we shouting at? Are we shouting at the kuffar? Because Allah has told us that they're not concerned about us, and why should they be? I mean, where have you seen the Muslims concerned about the social problems of the kuffar? Why should they be concerned? I mean, really, when we think about it, should we find fault in them for not helping the situation in Bosnia? Or if they're doing things to exacerbate it, are they at fault? Because as far as a lot of them are concerned, it's not to their interest to have a Muslim presence in Europe. So I think really ultimately they're just getting on with business. You know, they're doing what they perceive to be the best thing for them to do. And I think we have to be really careful about getting caught up in all that. Because Allah tells us constantly to rectify ourselves. You know, to deal with, you know, instead of constantly looking at the non-Muslims, look at the Muslims. You know, let's stop blaming them. They're only doing what they understand to be the best thing for them to do. I think a lot of the fault is that we haven't taken them the message. And the sad thing about it is, how can you take a message that you don't have? You know, like the Arabs say, فَاقِدُ شَيْءٍ لَا يُعْطِيهِ. You know, somebody that doesn't have something can't get it. So really, yeah, I think we need to. This is a time where and the jihads that are taking place in Bosnia, Kashmir, and these places, Palestine, these are valid jihads that no Muslim can say otherwise. But at the same time, I think in other places where we're not directly engaged in combat with people that are out to destroy us or to subjugate us, I think it's very important for the Muslims in this age to literally to disengage and to start reflecting deeply about how we got here, where we are, and some serious strategies for getting out of this morass and this horrific condition that we found ourselves in. And I think if we do that, something positive can happen.
Inshallah.
Yeah.
But once you've, say, been along to some ideological rally and you've managed to persuade your young 18-year-old to leave them and listen to you for a little bit, would you tell him that it is an obligation upon him to study Islam, try and learn a little bit of the great ulum that the past ulama expounded? Is that an obligation for him, or are there other legitimate things that he can be doing with his life?
Well, we have fard ayn and fard kifaya.
Has it become a fard ayn nowadays? Because
I personally believe, I mean, this is my, and I think a lot of ulama would agree with this, but I do believe that Arabic language is now an ayn because there are so few people that actually know it, that there's not a kifaya. Because fard kifaya means enough. If there's enough people doing it, then it's no longer obligatory on everybody else. So I personally do believe hadith sciences are obligatory on all of us. Memorizing the Quran is obligatory on all of us. Learning, because there's not enough people to do it. We don't have enough people, hufad of Quran now, to teach the children. And the Prophet said, خَيْرُكُمْ مَنْ تَعَلَّمَ الْقُرْآنَ وَعَلَّمَهُ. The best of you are those who learn the Quran and teach it. So this is the best and highest thing somebody can do. So I think, personally, what we need to do is, as individuals, is make a commitment. And this is something that I've been giving a lot of thought to and formulating in my own mind and understanding. We need to make a commitment to a methodology of the revival of Islam. And I believe that this has taken place several times historically, and every time it has been directly linked to the revival of the sciences of the deen. Imam al-Ghazali in his age, he's considered the mujaddid of his time by the consensus of the. I don't know any. I mean, it's like almost mujma alayh.
Imam al-Suyuti, when he talks about this hadith, which is a sound hadith, that there will be a mujaddid at the beginning of every century, he lists all of the ulama up to his own time, and the only one he says that there's no difference of opinion.
Allahu Akbar. Is Imam
al-Ghazali.
That's my understanding, that he was by consensus the mujaddid of his.
Allahu
Allahu Akbar.